You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 53. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
Over the last several episodes, episode 50 to 52, we've been talking about courage building and vulnerability as it relates to meeting people and as we're building relationships. So part of what we've talked about is knowing our context, the current reality, setting a goal or knowing where we're going. And then we've given you some experiments over the last few weeks, how to start where you are to get to where you want to be. So today we want to talk about that in greater depth. And Sarah, I think you have something you want to say about that.
Yeah, so part of what we've recognized is that if we're going to invite people to be followers of Jesus, first, we need to meet them. And that sounds silly and that sounds simple. But part of what we've recognized is that we have a challenge when it comes to meeting new people. What I mean by that is many of us are a part of congregations that a majority of the people have been around for 50, 60, 70 plus years. So let me just say this. And I'm going to say it as clearly as I can. If you don't want to experience a change in what the current reality is that you're facing in your local congregation, you probably don't need to listen to this episode, because we're going to invite you into 4 different stages, if I can say it that way, of building relationships with people so that you can meet new people. But if you don't want to meet new people, and if you don't want new people to be a part of the journey that you are on as a follower of Jesus, you don't have to participate in this. You can stay where you're at and not participate. But if you long to take your church and invite people into an unfolding journey with Jesus, we invite you to lean in a little bit closer, maybe even grab a pencil and a piece of paper and take some notes about the 4 phases that we're going to walk you through. One of the ways that I've tried to illustrate this with groups that I've been a part of, we talked about one of the ways in a previous episode. I'd invite people to stand in a circle based on the number of years that they've been a part of the church. Another way that you might do this is if you're in a meeting room at the church with your leaders, just invite everybody to stand up. And then say to folks, if you have been a part of a church, doesn't have to be that church, for 75 years or more, go ahead and be seated. 65 years or more, go ahead and be seated. 50 years or more, go ahead and be seated, and work down through the decades. And my guess is you're going to see that the people that are in that room have all been a part of the church for a long time. You may not even have people in that room who have been a part of the church for less than 20 years. And so part of what that tells us is that we haven't been meeting new people and then helping them to become followers of Jesus and then helping them to grow as leaders and stepping into leadership, because everybody who's sitting around the table has been a part of the church for 40 years or more.
So this is part of our current reality. That we've not been developing new relationships over the last 20 years, and maybe even those newer people that we have or younger people that we have in the congregation are probably children or grandchildren of the people who have been there for all these 50, 60, 70 years.
Right. So should we jump into the 4 phases?
Well, let's jump into the 4 phases. That we brought us to the place now of our context, and we don't want to keep beating that. But our reality is we're in need of developing relationships with people in our communities. This is not anything we're not adding anything to everyday life. This isn't something that you're going to have to sit down and study. It's just being who you are and being aware of the people around you. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah, I think the word that I would use is to be intentional about who you are and how Jesus is walking with you through your everyday, ordinary life. And so these 4 phases that we're going to walk through and some experiments that we're going to invite you into are intended to help you be intentional about that so that you can focus on following Jesus and meeting new people. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Okay. So
the only thing that I'm sorry, Sarah, I have to go back to this, and that is we ask you on a regular basis to identify Jesus in everyday situations and circumstances. This is really a part of that exercise.
Well, I wouldn't even call it an exercise. If that's what it is, then, well, I won't even go down that rabbit hole. If what you feel like we're doing is giving you an exercise to do, then it's likely you are not following Jesus in your everyday life. And I don't say that to be judgmental. I say that just as a reality check that if what we're pointing out feels to you like one more thing to do, that's not what it means to follow Jesus. It means to have him be on a journey with you in your everyday life. And really, he's not on a journey with you, you're on a journey with him.
So you said it better than I did. Let's start.
Phase 1 is unaware. Some of us are unaware that most people are not going to simply show up on Sunday morning for worship. Many of the people who are not in relationship with Jesus or not in relationship with a local church are unaware that the church even exists. So in this first phase, we're really seeking to raise awareness and make people aware that you as an individual exist as a follower of Jesus and the local church exists.
So what I would want to add to that, because I'm the old guy here, and that is there was a time when you could just count on people walking into the church because the church was so much a part of everyday life. That day is past.
Long past.
And that's why we need to begin to change our thinking or shift our thinking and shift our action into developing relationships with new people.
Right. And I would go as far as to say that we're living in a time that a growing number of people are unaware and even decidedly against the church. Notice I didn't say decidedly against Jesus. I said decidedly against the church. And many don't have a clue what is happening in the church. So if they are even thinking about connecting with a local congregation, they're going to check out a website, they're going to check out social media, and sometimes those things don't even exist for local congregations. When we talk about meeting folks in that place where they are unaware, what I want to remind you of is that we can't go from meeting someone to asking them to marry you. That's how I'm going to talk about this in a 5-minute conversation. So think back to a time in your life where you may have been dating people. Now, I know for some of you that's been a while, so just think back to that time. And on that first date, you would never expect the person that you were with or never want them to ask you to marry you. So think of this relational journey that we're going on. along that metaphor. So this first stage, it's going to seem like, wait, haven't we talked about that for the past few episodes? And isn't that a pretty simple question? Yes, it is, because it's really about raising awareness. So this is an experiment that really focuses in on meeting new people and, more importantly, listening to people and hearing what they have to say. So Tim, do you want to tell us what those two questions are? And folks, these should sound familiar.
Well, the first question would be, what do you love about your community? What do you love about this community? We've learned that people do like to talk, and this is a place that you could begin to have some interesting conversation just by asking the question, what do you love about the community? The second question would be, what would you change about the community?
So I did this over the weekend when I went to get gas for my car, and there was an attendant standing. It was one of our very cold days. There's an attendant standing in the midst of the different pumps. And I said to him, I said, can I ask you a question? And he said, sure, what? And I said, what do you love about this community? And he got a big grin on his face, and he said, well, I love that this community has a place for me to work. Now, I don't know if he said that because he was thinking that I was referring to the shopping plaza as a community. But I followed it up with the next question of what needs to change or be improved in the community. And he said, that's a good question. But he couldn't answer it. And so the conversation ended. And that's sometimes how it's going to work. It's not going to always lead to some grand epiphany, but you're having the conversation. You're reaching out to listen to people, to hear what they have to say. And if nothing else in that moment, for a couple of seconds, there was a smile on a man's face in the midst of his work, that he paused to remember how grateful he was for the job that he had on a very, 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 very cold day. So I hope, if nothing else, that was just a little ray of sunshine in an otherwise very cold day for him. I would have not wanted to be someone who was working outside that day, and he was. So in that moment, what did I do? All I did was raise some awareness for someone else. He may have forgotten it 3 seconds later, and that's okay. But I've participated in helping someone raise their awareness a little bit.
What's that do for you in asking the question?
Well, I wish that I would have been able to capture his facial expressions when he responded to that question, because I would have loved to have taken that picture and given it to a manager at the store where I got my gasoline, simply to say, one of your employees was working very hard on a very cold day, and this is what I saw in him. And so for me, it was an opportunity really to be a blessing to someone. And if you would have asked me that day, where did I see Jesus in the midst of my day? I would have said in that gentleman's face, because he was a ray of sunshine for me. And so it was raising my awareness as well.
So that's part of the reason we asked the question. You're not only trying to raise the awareness of somebody you're talking with, but it actually helps raise your awareness of the people around you.
Right. And so sometimes, and this would have been a context that may have happened, sometimes what happens in that moment is someone will say, well, what community are you talking about? The one where I live or the one where I'm at right now? Because often you're asking people when they're at work if it's, not someone that lives in that community. And so you're helping in that moment to move them from being not only unaware to being curious, because now they're wondering, what community are you talking about and why are you even asking this question? So before we go there, let me say one more thing about this phase 1 of being unaware. If you were going to do this, and we've assigned this to you as an experiment for the previous 3 episodes, if you wanted to practice this with the leaders in your church, so let's say there's 10 of you in a room, what I would say is have everyone in that room say to 2 people, God loves you and there's nothing you can do about it. And on the third person, then turn and ask them the question, what do you love about this community? And then your job in that moment is to simply listen. That's it. Nothing more.
So I was going to say that I asked that question with a group of people in a church even earlier today. What is it that you like about the community? And one of the responses that I got from one of the persons in the room was, I like the idea that I can be related to people who can help me become more who I'm supposed to be. That was not a setup question, but I thought that was a pretty good answer.
Yep. So in asking that question, then just that response, Tim, you were probably curious to know more and learn more about what was happening in that community and who made up the community.
You're right.
And curious or curiosity is phase 2 on the relational continuum. So we're moving people from being unaware to being curious, just as we're moving from being unaware to being curious. So in this phase, the experiment that we want to invite you into, if you are inside the church, the question might be something like, what's your first memory of church? And specifically the church that you are a part of. If it's someone who is not a part of that church, you might simply ask them the question, what can you tell me? I'm just going to say First Church because we've got lots of those. What can you tell me about First Church? Now, I guess I tend to do this at gas stations because the other example I'm thinking of is when I've stopped at gas stations. And I'll, instead of paying at the pump, I'll go in and ask the person at the cash register, hey, can you tell me anything about First Church just down the road from here? And Tim, what do you think the most common answer that I get is?
I don't know where that church is.
Bingo! That is the most frequent response. And then if I have a little bit of time, and I'm not a very good actor, so this has to be true for me. I can't pretend I don't know. If I really don't know where I'm going, I'll give them the address and say, this is the address. Do you know where that is at? Sometimes that prompts something. It also helps me to get where I'm going. So there's a little added bonus for me. And sometimes it's just, sorry, I don't know where that's at, and the conversation's over. Other times, what they'll point to is, oh, yeah, now I know the church that you're talking about. That's the church where I was married, or that's the church where my brother-in-law went when he lost his job because they have a ministry with people who are seeking employment. Or, yeah, I know that's where my mother-in-law went when my father-in-law died and they had a grief support group. It will often be a ministry of the church that someone that they know has been connected to, and they have gone to that church. Again, you're simply listening in these moments to hear what is, hear what they have to say in that moment, to raise their curiosity so that, because guess what happens? They'll be driving down that road and go, oh, that was the church that they asked you about. Now, if someone is already in the church And the first memory of church, you can go back to a previous episode where Tim and I both shared our first memories of church, and I think that was episode 52. And hear the difference in our memories simply because of the age at which our memories happened. If that is the scenario that you're working with, part of what you'll be doing is raising the awareness of people and raising the curiosity of people around what brought them to that local congregation. And what you will likely find is that it's other people who bring them to that local congregation. It is not the activities or what's on the church calendar that brings them there. Sometimes that's the case, but often you'll hear stories of people. And when I have done this with folks in the local church, often the same person's name ends up coming up over and over and over again. And something shifts in the life of the congregation when that one person or a few people are no longer a part of that local church because they moved due to a job change, or perhaps they died, whatever the case may be for them no longer participating. It was often a shift in the life of the church. And so that will help you to see what was happening at that time and see what might be missing right now.
As the conversation unfolded that I began just a few minutes ago, I asked them what they liked about their church, or the church that they were in. And one woman said, and I thought it was, for me, it was a revelation of something that I had not been thinking. She said, we have a couple of churches around us that have bands, and the kids all want to go to the bands and experience. That's what their experience of church is. She said, what I like about our church is, even though we don't have a band, we develop relationships, and it's those relationships that are meaningful. And all I could say to her was, and I was being very direct with her, but what I said was, there's never been a band that ever led anyone to Jesus. It's the relationship that brings people to Jesus. So if this is where we are with the church, then let us work on what we do well and not worry about what we don't do.
That's good. So if you wanted to lead a group of people in doing this, Tim's just modeled for you what that might look like. Simply asking people, what's your first memory of this church? Tim phrased the question a little bit differently in terms of what do you like about this church? I call that a dangerous question. And why I call that a dangerous question is because sometimes there isn't anything that people like about the church. They're at a place that they're frustrated. They're at a place that's a very hard question for them to answer. That's why I call it a dangerous question. Because you might get the answer, I don't like anything.
I'm glad I didn't get that response, because they probably wouldn't have liked what I'd said back to them.
And really, the point of phase 2 is not so much about what do you like and what do you not like. It's about what are you curious about, and helping folks to raise the curiosity. So however you frame the question, it's about raising people's curiosity about Jesus and the church. And that moves us into phase 3, which is what I call awakening or awakened. And so let me frame this one in this way by asking you to think about the last 24 hours of your life and what has happened. And maybe if you're working somewhere beyond the home, how would you classify what your wins for the day were? Or what lessons did you learn? When you think about yesterday in the past 24 hours, how are you feeling throughout the day? And as you think about it, what are you thankful for right now from that day? Did you read anything or hear anything? What stood out? And once you have enough of yesterday in your memory, now answer the question, where did you experience Jesus?
So are you asking me that question now?
That long pregnant pause was for you.
Over the last 24 hours, one of the places that I met Jesus was just at a table eating brunch or lunch. It's inevitable that Jesus shows up to me and people, and there are some people with whom I associate and had lunch yesterday. That Jesus just continues to show up in that person's life. I can almost guess that. There are other places too, like even the person that waited on us yesterday had such a delightful, and I don't know whether it was personality or just her disposition, that the way she even made us feel good about being there. It was like it was important to her that we could experience something good. I could experience Jesus even in that moment. Another time yesterday, which really seemed strange, was even in a television commercial that just gripped my heart. And as I was watching the commercial, I didn't even know I was watching a commercial until after they got to the place of selling their product. But it was the kind of an experience that I was involved in, and I don't mean to think that Jesus can come through the television, but I do think that the very presence of God captures us at moments that we're not expecting it, unless we're prepared to be able to recognize it when it happens. Does that helpful?
Yeah, I would just echo what you said about seeing Jesus in people. For me, the number of times that I find myself saying, well, it was when I was eating a meal and sitting around a table with someone. And then the one that I would add is I was having text message conversations with two different people. They were completely two different conversations, but both of them, as I reflect back on it, brought Jesus into focus for me for different reasons. One, because we were cracking up and laughing about things that it was kind of mind-boggling to even see. The other, because I was receiving pictures of one of my great nieces, and it's very hard for me not to see the presence of Christ in children. I mean, I could go on and on and on for days, and you would never listen to this podcast again for the number of times I could go on and on and on about children reminding me of Christ's presence in our midst. So simply what we just modeled for you, that act of just go back over the past 24 hours and ask yourself, where was Jesus in the midst of it? And sometimes we lose Jesus someplace along that path. Now, no, Jesus is always with you. So hear me. I'm not I'm not doing horrible theology here. What I mean by that is, in terms of you losing Jesus, is that he's nowhere on your radar and you are not aware of his presence. He will always be with you. The question is, did you leave him behind? And I ask you to consider that, because maybe there were things that you said or did or didn't do that don't reflect the love that Jesus has offered to you. And that would be a way that you would say you lost Jesus. So this third phase is really about waking people up to Christ's presence in their everyday, ordinary life. So you can do what we just walked you through with groups of leaders as you're preparing to start a meeting. And it doesn't matter if it's a trustee meeting or a finance meeting or a staff parish meeting or a building committee meeting. It doesn't matter, because all of those things in the work of the church should be helping people to be formed in Christ. And in just a few minutes, you can help folks to take another step on their journey with Jesus and lead them to a place that is really what phase 4 is, and it's commitment, or being committed. And this is where I would say the real work of disciple making begins. And you have heard us over previous episodes walk through the 4 different aspects of a disciple making system, with hospitality and offering Christ and practices and engagement. We use the acronym of HOPE to talk about it. This is the place where we're really asking one another and meeting with one another and holding one another accountable for not only our prayers and our presence and our gifts and our service, but how are you using your gifts, and are you remaining faithful to who Jesus is inviting you to be? And so that's the question for this phase, is to say, Jesus, who are you inviting me to be? And to ask someone else, who's Jesus inviting them to be? And how can you pray for them so that they can continue on that journey of growing to be the person that God has created him to be?
So part of what I like about this is that somewhere along the line that I made a decision in my life that everyone with whom I have contact is put in my way to help me become more who God created me to be. So if I'm asking the question, who am I supposed to be? Jesus, who am I supposed to be at this moment? It also opens me up to be able to see Jesus in the person or the situation in which I'm involved. Because in every moment, in every encounter, I'm really becoming more who God has created me to be by that interaction.
Right.
That's part of what I hear when you ask that question.
And so what I would remind you is each of the 4 phases that we just walked through, from being unaware to being curious to being awakened to being committed, as you step into the experiments and do them for the first time, you might feel weird or odd or vulnerable. And that's why it's called courage. And that's exactly why you need to do it. Now, when I've done this with groups of people, as inviting them to practice it, what I usually say to them at this point is, nobody just died doing that. It was okay. So if you step out of this room and begin to do it, it's going to be okay. It's not always going to go smoothly. The question's not always going to come out of your mouth the way that you intended it to come out of your mouth. And that's okay. Try, and then try again, and do it again. Because as you continue that practice and as you continue that journey, it just might be that person that we talked about back in phase 2, I think it was, who was the reason why someone came to that church, could be you.
How cool would that be? That'd be pretty awesome if we actually begin to act out and live what we say we want, instead of making it an intellectual exercise. It actually becomes the way we live.
Right. The other thing that I would say is the journey of following Jesus, and I'm going to speak from my personal experience here now. I haven't always liked everything Jesus has invited me to do. And yet I did it anyway. And when I didn't do it, I was often disappointed in myself because I knew what I was being invited into. There's nowhere in what it means to be faithful that says you have to feel comfortable the first time you try something. That's not what it's about. And so part of what I know that we're doing is we're pushing you and we're inviting you to do things that may be uncomfortable. And that's okay. It's okay to acknowledge that it feels uncomfortable or weird. It's not okay not to do anything and then complain that you don't have enough people, you don't have any young people, and you don't have enough money. If we're going to dare to lead in this missional time, we're going to have to practice the vulnerability of building relationships.
So, Sarah, you've given us a pattern now to follow. Understanding our being unaware, and that's just not just us, but the people with whom that we see in the world. I mean, any given Sunday morning, if you weren't in church, you'd find a whole lot more people doing activities outside the church, and those are the people we want to engage in some way. And in that, in becoming aware, we're trying to become curious. That curiosity leads us then to a new way of looking at things, or an awakening, and then making some commitments. You can start that practice just with the leaders of your own congregation and really have fun with it. If you'd say, this next week, we're going to do this with people in the community, and then come back and have that conversation among yourselves.
If you only do this with the leaders in your church, nothing is going to change. This is not intended to stay within the walls of the church. We're encouraging you to start there so that you have the experience and the practice, some muscle memory, if I can say it that way, of doing it once, so that you can go out into the world and practice this and experiment with it and live it, so that as you journey as a follower of Jesus, you're continuing this pattern of unaware, curious, awakening, and commitment, not just with the leaders with whom you meet, but with the people that you interact with on a daily life. So, which challenge that we've placed out in front of you will you integrate into your behavior in this next week?
And what I would say as we do come to a close of this episode, you and I are designed to be able to not only see God in other people, or see Jesus in other people, but to allow Jesus to be seen in us. And one of the great things that we have the opportunity to do is to recognize Jesus in one another. And how cool would it be if we actually began doing that very thing on an everyday basis, wherever you are, becoming more who God created you to be, not because you're doing some program or have attended some event, but just because that's who you are as a follower of Jesus.
As we wrap up this episode, let me remind you that you can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/053.
When you get off this podcast, you're in the mission field, where there are people who are waiting. They don't even know it yet, but are waiting to be asked the very questions that we've been talking about today, because they want to be in relationship. The joy and peace of this life comes in developing those relationships and celebrating life with people that we may not even know. So when you get off this podcast, go knowing that there's a God who loves you in Jesus and who will empower you to have the courage to ask the question, what do you like about this community and what needs to change?
Go lead a movement of Jesus followers. Bye for now.